Edith Palmer-Delamere didn't just live a life of luxury, she was obsessed with it. After her early days in the spotlight as a model, she moved through life with an intense need for extravagance and youth. By the time she settled in Boynton Beach, Florida, her reputation as a wealthy, demanding woman was well known. She was the kind of person who turned heads wherever she went, always draped in designer clothes, with an air of authority that made her hard to miss. Despite her age, Edie refused to slow down. She poured money into cosmetic procedures to keep her youthful appearance and spent her time in high-end boutiques, salons, and spas, determined to stay the center of attention. But no matter how much she spent or how young she looked, there was something deeply unsettling about the way she lived. Her daughter, Lila, had always struggled under Edie's shadow. While Edie built a life focused on beauty and control, Lila sought peace and independence. The years apart had done little to heal the wounds between them, and when Lila returned from Japan, their relationship remained distant and cold. Edie's constant criticism of her daughter only deepened the rift. At the time of her death, Edie was preparing for yet another wedding, this time to a man much younger than herself. Her obsession with youth and control had reached a peak, and it was clear to those around her that she was determined to stay in control of everyone and everything, including Lila. However, in the days leading up to the wedding, this carefully crafted world was about to unravel in the most violent way possible. On a quiet morning in January 2013, Boynton Beach seemed just like any other day. The sun was shining, and the residents of this peaceful Florida town were going about their usual routines. It was a place known for its relaxed lifestyle, where retirees enjoyed the warmth and calm of the area. But on that particular day, something dark and terrible was about to unfold behind the doors of one of its upscale homes. Inside Edith Palmer-Delamere's luxurious house, things were far from normal. The serene neighborhood was about to be shaken by a crime so brutal that it would haunt the town for years to come. At 9:30 a.m., Lila Palmer-Delamere arrived at her mother's home to finalize some last-minute wedding details. Edie, always obsessed with perfection, had been busy preparing for her grand fifth wedding. But as Lila entered the house, the eerie silence hit her. Something was off. The usual sounds of her mother bustling about or playing music were gone. Instead, there was an unsettling stillness. As she called out for her mother and got no response, her unease grew. When she made her way upstairs to her mother's bedroom, what she found was a nightmare: her mother, lifeless in bed. Edith Palmer-Delamere's life had always been far from ordinary. Born in Zambia to British parents, she grew up surrounded by the untamed beauty of Africa. Her early years were filled with adventure, but it wasn't long before Edith, known as Edie, sought something bigger. In her late teens, she moved to London, where she quickly found herself immersed in the city's vibrant scene during the swinging 60s. It was a time when fashion, culture, and art collided, and Edie was right in the middle of it. She became a model, and her striking looks opened doors to the high society of London. She mingled with celebrities, artists, and the elite, always striving to be noticed and admired. But modeling was only a part of her story. Edie's real passion was for the finer things in life. She craved luxury, power, and control, and she used her looks and charm to climb the social ladder. Over the years, she married 4 times, each marriage more extravagant than the last. Her life was a whirlwind of glamorous parties, expensive vacations, and high-end shopping. But beneath the surface, Edie was always chasing something she could never quite hold on to: a sense of youth and control that slowly slipped away with time. By the time she reached her later years, Edie had settled in Boynton Beach, Florida, but her taste for luxury had not faded. Even in this quiet retirement community, she was known for her lavish lifestyle and love for younger men. It seemed that no matter where she went, Edie was always determined to live life on her terms, no matter the cost. Edith Palmer-Delamere had a personality that could fill a room. She was bold, confident, and above all, demanding. Her love for luxury wasn't just about material things, it was a way of life. Edie thrived on control, whether it was over her looks, her possessions, or the people around her. She was the kind of woman who expected everything to go her way, and she had little patience for anything or anyone that didn't meet her high standards. This need for control extended deeply into her personal relationships, especially with her daughter Lila. Their relationship was anything but warm. Edie's obsession with youth and perfection often turned into harsh criticism, which drove a wedge between them. She saw Lila as someone who didn't live up to her expectations, both in appearance and in life choices. The constant comparisons and criticisms from Edie left Lila feeling inadequate and distant from her mother. While Edie was busy maintaining her image and surrounding herself with younger men, Lila had spent years trying to find her own path, far away from her mother's overpowering presence. Their reunion in late 2012, after years apart, wasn't the healing moment one might hope for. Instead, it was filled with tension, as Edie remained fixated on her upcoming fifth wedding, leaving little room for any real connection with her daughter. Outside of her strained relationship with Elle. The morning of January 15, 2013, began like any other in Boynton Beach, Florida. The sun rose over the quiet neighborhood, where residents went about their daily routines. But inside Edith Palmer-Delamere's home, something horrific was about to be uncovered. At around 9:30 a.m., Lila Palmer-Delamere arrived at her mother's house to finalize details for the extravagant wedding Edie had been meticulously planning. As Lila entered the house, she immediately sensed that something was wrong. The usual energy that filled Edie's home was missing. The air was thick with an unsettling silence. No sounds of Edie bustling around, no music playing from her carefully curated vintage record collection. Lila called out for her mother, but there was no response. With growing unease, she made her way upstairs, where her mother's lavish bedroom awaited. The room, usually a showcase of Edie's wealth and taste, was now the scene of a nightmare. Edie lay motionless on her bed, the once vibrant and controlling woman now eerily still. She was naked, and her face, once a symbol of her relentless pursuit of beauty, was marred by violence. A gunshot wound had ended her life, but the horror didn't stop there. Her eyes had been cruelly mutilated. Frozen in shock, Lila stared at the gruesome scene before her. The weight of what she was seeing slowly began to sink in, and panic took over. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone and dialed 911, struggling to find the words to describe the horror she had just stumbled upon. The moment Lila Palmer-Delamere saw her mother's lifeless body, her mind went blank. The shock of finding Edith, the woman who had dominated so much of her life, lying dead in her own bedroom, was too much to process. For a few seconds, she was frozen, her eyes locked on the gruesome scene. The blood, the unnatural stillness of her mother, and the horror of what had been done to her face, it was all too overwhelming. But soon panic set in. Her heart raced as her hands fumbled for her phone. When she finally managed to dial 911, her voice was shaky, barely able to get the words out. "My mother's ... she's dead ... there's blood everywhere," she stammered, struggling to explain the nightmare she had walked into. The operator's calm questions seemed distant, almost unreal, as Lila tried to make sense of the situation. Her mind raced as she described the scene to the 911 operator, barely able to comprehend what had happened. She kept repeating, "There's blood everywhere ... my mother's dead," as if saying it out loud would somehow make it easier to believe. But nothing could make this moment easier. In her frantic state, Lila waited for the police to arrive, her whole world crumbling around her. When the Boynton Beach police arrived at Edith Palmer-Delamere's house, the peaceful neighborhood was already buzzing with shock. Sirens cut through the still morning air as officers quickly secured the area. Lila, visibly shaken, was escorted outside to wait while investigators entered the house. Her face was pale, her hands still trembling from the discovery. Inside, the crime scene was nothing short of horrific. Edith's bedroom, once a picture of luxury, was now a site of brutal violence. Detective Gregor Harbinski, a seasoned investigator with decades of experience, took charge. He had seen many crime scenes in his career, but the brutality of this one was disturbing. Edie's lifeless body lay in her bed, and the vicious nature of the attack was immediately apparent. The crime scene team worked methodically, photographing every detail of the room, carefully gathering evidence. Bloodstains covered the satin sheets, and the ballpoint pen used to mutilate Edie's eyes lay discarded near the bed. The intensity of the violence pointed to something personal. This wasn't the work of a random intruder. Detective Harbinski and his team began collecting anything that could offer clues: fingerprints, potential DNA, and items from the room. However, with the number of people who had been in and out of Edith's life, her staff, frequent visitors, and relationships with younger men, it was clear this investigation would be anything but simple. The team knew they were dealing with a crime driven by deep emotion, and they needed to find out who had the motive to kill Edith in such a gruesome way. With the severity of the crime becoming clear, Detective Gregor Harbinski reached out to the FBI for additional support. Given the brutal nature of Edith's murder, it was essential to understand the mindset behind such a violent act. Dr. Camilla Kapoor, a renowned criminal psychologist and profiler specializing in violent crimes, was brought in to assist with the case. Dr. Kapoor studied the crime scene photos and details of the investigation with a keen eye. Her experience with cases involving intense personal connections gave her insight into the mind of the killer. After reviewing the evidence, she offered a disturbing but enlightening profile. She believed that the murderer was someone very close to Edith, driven by deep-rooted anger and jealousy. The act of gouging out Edith's eyes suggested something symbolic. Perhaps the killer felt judged or belittled by her gaze. In Dr. Kapoor's view, this wasn't just about killing Edith. It was about silencing her, erasing her presence, and ultimately gaining control over her in the most violent way possible. The mutilation of her face pointed to personal resentment, possibly a family member or someone intimately involved in her life. The emotional connection between the victim and the killer was undeniable. This wasn't the work of a cold-blooded stranger. It was someone with a complex and destructive relationship with Edith. Dr. Kapoor's analysis added a new dimension to the investigation, shifting the focus to Edith's closest connections. The profiler's insights suggested the killer had a history with Edith, someone who felt trapped or powerless under her influence, and had finally lashed out in the most horrific way. With this psychological profile in hand, the police turned their attention to Edith's inner circle, knowing that the person responsible was likely someone she knew well. As the investigation unfolded, all eyes turned to Lila Palmer-Delamere, Edith's only daughter. From the outside, Lila appeared to be a quiet, reserved woman who had lived much of her life in the shadow of her demanding and controlling mother. But beneath the surface, the relationship between Lila and Edith had been strained for years, filled with resentment and bitterness. Edith's constant criticism and harsh treatment had taken a toll on Lila, who had spent much of her adult life trying to distance herself from her mother's dominating influence. Lila had returned from Japan only a year before the murder, hoping for some sort of reconciliation. Instead, she found herself once again caught under Edith's thumb, feeling powerless and overshadowed by her mother's larger-than-life personality. Friends and acquaintances noticed that Lila had become more withdrawn and anxious in the months leading up to the murder. She often spoke of feeling trapped by her mother's presence and struggled financially after years of living abroad. But it wasn't just the strained relationship that made Lila a prime suspect. The police uncovered that Edith had been having an affair with Lila's younger boyfriend, Jake DeCastro. This betrayal was likely the final blow for Lila, who had already spent years dealing with her mother's emotional abuse. The discovery that her own mother was involved with the man she had taken into her life pushed Lila's frustrations to a breaking point. While Lila maintained that she had nothing to do with the murder, her weak alibi and the deep emotional wounds she carried made her a strong person of interest. The police knew they needed to dig deeper into her life, as the signs were pointing towards someone who had suffered for years under Edith's control and who may have finally snapped. As investigators delved deeper into the case, Jake DeCastro, Lila's boyfriend, emerged as a central figure. Jake was an 18-year-old undocumented immigrant from Argentina who had been living in Boynton Beach for several months. His life was anything but stable, working odd jobs like landscaping and dishwashing just to make ends meet. But despite his rough circumstances, Jake was charming, especially when it came to the older women of the wealthy community. Lila had taken Jake in when he was at his most vulnerable, offering him a place to stay and even some financial support. Their relationship, however, wasn't built on love. Jake saw it more as a transactional arrangement. He gave Lila companionship and intimacy, and in return she provided him with security and protection from his unstable immigration status. It wasn't long before Edith took notice of Jake, and her interest in him grew rapidly. Edith's attraction to Jake wasn't subtle. Known for her fondness for younger men, she lavished him with gifts, expensive watches, designer clothes, and even hinted at a future together. Jake, always looking for an opportunity to better his situation, entertained Edith's advances. After all, Edith's wealth and lifestyle offered a chance to escape the uncertainty of his life as an undocumented immigrant. The idea of trading Lila for her much wealthier mother was tempting, and Jake didn't hide that he saw Edith as a potential way out. When the police questioned Jake, his answers were evasive. Amid the investigation, a key piece of evidence emerged that shifted the case in a new direction: a torn note found in Edith Palmer-Delamere's bedside drawer. Detective Karen Martins, who had been meticulously going through Edith's personal belongings, came across this small but significant clue. The note was crumpled and shoved to the back of the drawer, as if someone had hastily tried to discard it. What made the note especially intriguing was its content. Though incomplete, the remaining fragments were enough to suggest something was deeply wrong in Edith's personal life. The note contained a few legible words, including "Rick betrayal will" and a sharp expletive. The handwriting was confirmed to be Edith's, and it raised immediate suspicion about her fiancé, Rick Lasker, and their contentious relationship leading up to her murder. Edith's recent engagement to Rick had been anything but smooth. They argued frequently, particularly over financial matters and the prenuptial agreement she insisted on. Edith's wealth had always been her safeguard, and she was determined to protect it. The note hinted that she may have been reconsidering her will or discovered something unsettling about Rick. This newfound information reinforced the theory that the motive behind Edith's death could be tied to money. The detectives knew they needed to dig deeper into Rick's financial situation, and the torn note was a crucial clue. If Edith had planned to make changes to her will or suspected Rick of betrayal, it could have been the tipping point that led to her violent murder. The note's discovery added new pressure to the investigation, making Rick a person of even greater interest. As the days passed, the investigation into Edith Palmer-Delamere's murder seemed to be reaching a deadlock. The police had their suspicions about multiple people, but no concrete evidence tied anyone directly to the crime. That all changed on the chilly morning of January 30th, 2013. A crucial breakthrough finally came to light, one that would crack the case wide open. Detective Gregor Harbinski had been meticulously piecing together all the evidence, hoping that something would eventually stand out. Then, it happened. A forensic analysis of Lila's phone records revealed a shocking find. Lila had purchased a .38 caliber revolver just days before Edith's murder, the same caliber as the bullets found at the crime scene. This discovery was the turning point the investigators needed. With the gun purchase linked to Lila, the police now had a tangible connection to the murder weapon. But it wasn't just the gun that implicated her. Further ballistic tests confirmed that the bullets used in the murder came from the very gun Lila had bought. As if that wasn't enough, another damning piece of evidence surfaced. Lila's fingerprints were found on the ballpoint pen used to mutilate Edith's eyes. This gruesome detail painted a chilling picture of Lila's involvement, and suddenly, the case that had baffled investigators began to make sense. The theory was clear. Lila, overwhelmed by years of emotional abuse, betrayal, and jealousy over her mother's affair with Jake, had snapped. In a fit of blind rage, she not only shot Edith but desecrated her body in a way that revealed deep-seated hatred. The police now had enough evidence to arrest Lila, the woman who had been at the center of the investigation all along, but had, until now. On the evening of January 30th, 2013, police officers arrived at Lila Palmer-Delamere's modest apartment in West Palm Beach. There was no need for a dramatic confrontation. Lila, already weighed down by the events of the past weeks, seemed almost resigned when they knocked on her door. As the officers informed her of her arrest for the murder of her mother, Edith, she barely reacted. No outbursts, no tears. She simply muttered, "You've got me," and allowed herself to be handcuffed without resistance. The news of Lila's arrest sent shockwaves through Boynton Beach. The community, already reeling from the brutality of Edith's murder, was now faced with the horrifying reality that her own daughter had committed the crime. Neighbors and acquaintances who had known both Edith and Lila were stunned. Some couldn't believe that the quiet, soft-spoken Lila could be capable of such a heinous act. Others, who were more aware of the strained relationship between mother and daughter, whispered that it had only been a matter of time before something tragic happened. Edith's fiancé, Rick Lasker, who had been under suspicion himself, expressed both relief and devastation. While the cloud of doubt had been lifted from him, the realization that the murder had come from within the family left him shattered. Jake DeCastro, Lila's boyfriend, and another. Lila Palmer-Delamere's trial for the murder of her mother, Edith, began on July 15, 2013, in the Palm Beach County Courthouse. The case had already become one of the most talked-about trials in Boynton Beach, with locals eager to see how the shocking family tragedy would unfold in the courtroom. Media attention was high, and people from the community filled the seats each day, watching as the prosecution and defense presented their arguments. Assistant State Attorney Jennifer Wright Ponzar led the prosecution. Known for her sharp, no-nonsense style, she portrayed Lila as a cold and calculated killer, driven by years of resentment and jealousy toward her mother. The evidence was damning: the gun purchase, the forensic proof tying the bullets to Lila's revolver, and her fingerprints on the pen used to mutilate Edith. Wright Ponzar didn't hold back in emphasizing Lila's motive, pointing to the years of emotional abuse and the final betrayal of her mother's affair with her boyfriend, Jake DeCastro. On the other side, Lila's defense attorney, Paul Adams, took a different approach. Adams painted Lila as a deeply troubled woman who had been pushed to her breaking point by years of psychological manipulation and emotional torment at the hands of her mother. He argued that Lila's actions were not premeditated, but the result of a moment of uncontrollable rage. Throughout the trial, Adams focused on Lila's mental state, bringing in expert witnesses who testified to her history of depression, anxiety, and emotional instability, which had worsened after discovering the affair. As the trial continued, the tension in the courtroom grew. Friends of Edith, former acquaintances, and even those who had known Lila were called to testify. Some spoke of Edith's overbearing and controlling nature, while others focused on Lila's quiet demeanor and the emotional toll of living in her mother's shadow. But no testimony could undo the hard evidence that tied Lila directly to the crime. On August 2, 2013, after 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom was silent as the judge sentenced Lila to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Lila, who had remained emotionless throughout most of the trial, showed no visible reaction as her fate was sealed. For the people of Boynton Beach, the trial's conclusion brought a sense of closure, but it was a bitter one. Some believed justice had been served, while others felt sympathy for Lila, seeing her not just as a murderer, but as another victim of Edith's controlling ways. As Lila was led away to begin her life sentence, the tragic story of the Delamere family left a lasting mark on the community, one that would not be forgotten anytime soon.